For a transition effect that covers all buttons in a scene, go to the script that you want to have activate the transition animation. Inside, we will create a custom function called getAllButtons. This will have a custom variable passed, which will be used as the starting point for grabbing all the button nodes that are children of it, or that are children of it, and so on. This function will return an array, so we add this arrow pointing to an array at the top. Basically, this means that we will be setting a variable equal to this function later on. So we need to define what this function can be equal to. Inside, we create a custom variable called buttons. This will store the button nodes. Then we search through every child of the node variable's children. If that child is a button, then we add it to the end of the array. And if that child has children, then we add its button children as well. We do this so that if there is a button that is a child of a container, then it will be included despite not being a direct child of the custom node variable. Lastly, we return the buttons array. We then create another custom function. This function will be used to sort the array with all the button nodes. This function needs an A and B custom variable, as those two are what will be compared. Additionally, we will return a bool. Inside, we first check if the two buttons being compared have the same global Y position. If so, then we return true if B has a greater X position, and false if it doesn't. Then in the case that the Y positions aren't equal, then we return true if B has a greater global Y position, and false if it doesn't. When we call this function inside of the sort custom function later, it will simply reorganize the order of the buttons inside of the array we created in the previous custom function. The order will be from the topmost button to the bottommost, and if there are any buttons on the same Y position, then we go from left to right before continuing downwards. If you want, you can change the lesser and greater than signs to change the order of the buttons. Finally, we create a custom function that we will call to animate the buttons in the transition effect. This will have 6 built-in variables. First is the array of buttons, which will need to be passed so we can call the function. So we just define it without setting a default value. Forward is used to define the direction of the transition, so we can set forward to true to introduce the buttons and false to hide them away. Delay between buttons is the amount of time after we tween a button that we will have to wait until we can tween the next. Move offset is the position we offset the button by so that we can create the fade in and fade out animation. Scale offset is the scale that we will set the button to. Keep in mind that this animation will either make the button equal to a scale of 1 by 1 or to whatever we set this scale offset to, based on if forward is set to true or not. If forward is set to true, then we will set the button scale to scale offset and tween towards a scale of 1 by 1 and vice versa. Lastly, animation length is how long the animation per button takes to complete. All these variables, except for the button array, has an equal sign so that there is a default value, allowing you to just pass the buttons array and ignore all the other values if you want. Next, we first check if forward is set to false. Then we reverse the order of the buttons array. We do this so that the fade in is from top to bottom, left to right, and the fade out is from bottom to top, right to left. Although, feel free to remove this if you would like. Next, we create a loop for setting every button inside the array to their starting state. This includes modulate and scale. We ignore position here because otherwise the buttons will slowly offset until they are off the screen. For modulate.a, we set it to be 0 if forward is set to true, else 1.0. When it comes to modulate.a, if you intend to run this fade in animation at the start of your scene, then I recommend having all your buttons start on a modulate.a of 0 before running this function. This can be done by either manually setting the modulate value on each individual button or adding this line of code when we are grabbing all the buttons. I will explain this further when we talk about calling the animation function inside the ready function. As for scale, we first set the origin of the button to the left of the button middle. You can change this origin however you like. Then we set the scale to either scale offset or a vector 2 of 1 by 1 based on the forward variable. Once the buttons are in their correct starting positions, we iterate through the buttons array again, this time to establish 4 variables to handle tweening or the animation of the buttons. The first will establish what easing we will use for the tweens. Then we create a tween for each property that we are changing, using a transition of back for a smoother animation. Then we establish 3 more variables for the target that we want to tween towards. For position, we either remove or add the offset based on the forward variable. For modulate, we target the opposite of what we set earlier, and we do the same for scale. Then we grab the respective tween and call tween property, grabbing the button, then its respective property, then the target, then we pass the animation length. Finally, to add an offset to the animation between the buttons, we await a timer with the delay between buttons custom variable. Now, when we want to call this animation, first set a variable to the function that will get all the buttons in the scene with the highest most parent node in the brackets. Then we use sort custom on that array with our custom sorting algorithm that we wrote earlier. Then finally, you can call the animate buttons function, passing a duplicate of the buttons. Keep in mind that you only need to duplicate the buttons if you intend to use this variable again, as when we call reverse on the array, it'll reverse this variable as well. So calling duplicate will make sure that that reverse itself is self-contained within the animate buttons function. Additionally, you can choose to not use the default values set inside the animate function and add them separated by commas inside the function bracket. Continuing from what I said earlier, in the case that you are using this animation in the ready function, we need to delay by a frame or so before we call the animate function. This is because in the case that you are using a container of some type, the container during the time when it is getting ready may override the starting position or pivot offset that we are setting inside of the animation function. So we wait for a frame for that to occur. Then we should be able to call the animate buttons function without any issue. This delay is also why we may want to set the modulate to 0 before the animation function, as to avoid the buttons being visible for a frame earlier, although this could be hidden behind a scene transition animation if you have that. Additionally, if the scale of the buttons is not smooth, then go to Project Settings. In Filter Settings, search for Snap Controls to Pixels, select Common, and make sure it is disabled. Now you have a smooth sequential button transition animation that you can add to any scene with button nodes, with the ability to add more to the animation or change it however you like. And don't forget that you can check out the project files, link in the description.